Today's lesson is lesson 7-12 from Scott Forsman, 5th grade math. And the lesson is on comparing and ordering fractions and mixed numbers. Our objective is that you, the students, will be able to compare mixed numbers and fractions by finding common denominators. We're going to be using a couple of things we've already learned. One is least common multiples, so we're going to need to know that skill, and equivalent fractions. And so in order to have success in this lesson, you're going to have to remember both of those. Least common multiple, that's lesson 7-4, and then equivalent fractions, that's lesson 7-7, and we will be using both of those on every one of our problems today. So if you are at all unclear on how to find the least common multiple or to convert fractions to equivalent fractions, please review those two lessons before continuing with this particular lesson. All right, here's our notes. How do I compare fractions and mixed numbers? So once you find the method of doing that, write them in here. Maybe write an example problem or two. Bring your notes to class for review. All right, so when our denominators are the same, it's super easy to compare the fractions. So let's just take a look at a fraction 7/12 and comparing that to something like 5/12. We have same denominators. If you have the same denominators, you're just comparing the numerators. Then 7 is greater than 5, so 7/12 is greater than 5/12. So again, these things need to be the same, the denominators. Let's take a look at another one. You have a 1/4. Is that less than, greater than, or equal to 3/4? And again, if you have denominators the same, you're just comparing the numerators. 1 is less than 3, and so it gets written in that manner. Now, you might have today fractions that have the same denominators, but chances are they're going to have different denominators. So our goal today, common denominators. Almost wrote denominators. Common denominators. All right, get them. It's super important. Here's our first example, all right, where we're going to do the common denominators method. There's another method, and that's going to be on a different video. But today we're going to find common denominators. So the way to do that is we start by writing out each fraction. I'm going to write the comparison in between there. And then we're going to find something that the denominators have in common. And we do that by, number one, we find the least common multiple of the denominators. I'm going to abbreviate least common multiple of the denominators. So we do that by finding least common multiple, right? So it's 4 and 6, and we're going to find out everything that they have in common here by listing out the multiples. So for 4, it's 4, 8, 12, 16, and on. And for 6, it's 6 and 12. And again, once you have something that's on both lists, that becomes your least common multiple. That's what we're going to be using to find the new denominator. All right, so check, we've done number 1. Number 2, we're going to write equivalent fractions. All right, and our equivalent fractions are going to be using our least common multiple as the new denominator. So we need to find 3/4 with equivalent with to a fraction with a denominator of 12, and 5/6 equivalent to a fraction with the denominator of 12. All right, on the 3/4 side, we know that the denominator was 4, and it's going to change to 12. We have to figure out what we multiply by 4 to get 12, and that would be times 3. So the denominator was 4 times 3. In order to maintain equivalency, we have to multiply the same value times the numerator. So 3 times 3 equals 9. So 3/4 equals 9/12. On the 5/6 side now, 6 to 12 would be a multiply by 2 situation, and then we have to do the same thing to the numerator. 5 times 2 is 10. 9 twelfths is our new fraction here. 10 twelfths is our new fraction here. And again, if the denominators are the same, then just comparing the numerators. So 9 is less than 10, and so that should be your symbol. 3/4 is less than 5/6. So the way we do that, number one, find the least common denominator, or least common multiple of the denominators, then find equivalent fractions, and then number 3 is just compare the numerators. I guess I can write out compare numerators. And again, we're going to be finding common denominators. In this situation, we have a mixed number here, 2 and 5/8, and we're going to be comparing that to a mixed number, 2 and 3/4. If the whole numbers of your mixed number are the same, we only need to compare the fractions. So we're only going to be comparing 5/8 and 3/4. So we only need to use the fractions. We don't even need to write in the big whole number there. So 3/4, and comparing that to 5/8. So number one, we're finding the least common multiple of the denominators, and so that would be 8 and 4, 8, 16, 24, and so on. And for 4, you have 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, and so on. And so why did I keep on listing things when the least common multiple was obviously going to be 8? The answer is, when you're comparing fractions, you just have to have a common denominator. It doesn't have to be the least common denominator. And in fact, when you're adding and subtracting fractions, you just have to have a common denominator. To find the least common denominator means you're going to have less reducing and simplifying at the end. So that's why they always say find the least common multiple. It's good practice though. All right, so our least common multiple is 8. Therefore, we're going to convert each one of these fractions to an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 8. This one already has a denominator of 8. We don't need to do anything with that fraction. But this fraction needs to have a common denominator with the other fraction. So we're going to convert it to having equivalent fraction with a denominator of 8. So 4 times something equals 8, and it happens to be times 2. And then the numerator gets multiplied by 2 as well. If you don't multiply by the same number, you don't have equivalent fractions. So 3 times 2 equals 6. And in this situation, 5/8 is less than 6/8. And so it gets one of those symbols. So 2 and 5/8 is less than 2 and 3/4. Moving on through a couple more examples. Skip the page. All right, here we have 2/3, and we're going to compare that to 4/7. First thing we're going to be doing is finding the least common multiple of the denominators. So that's 2/3 and 4/7. Here you have 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, and 21. And remember, the least common multiple of two numbers will never be higher than those two numbers multiplied together. So 3 times 7 is 21. I don't need to go past 21 as I'm listing out all of the multiples. All right, so then 7 becomes 7, 14, and then 21. And now I see that 21 is on both lists. All right, using that least common multiple, we're going to find equivalent fractions, which is step 2. So equivalent fractions for 4/7 with a denominator of 21. We see that 7 times 3 equals 21, multiplying the numerator by the same thing. It's 4 times 3 equals 12. Now the other fraction has a denominator of 3, so we need to convert that also to have common denominators. So the new denominator will be 21. 3 times 7 equals 21. And on the numerator side, it's also times 7. 2 times 7 equals 14. Now it's simple to see 14 is greater than 12, and it gets the greater than symbol. Take a look at number 2. 2 and 11/12 is that greater than, less than, or equal to 1 7/8. And here you have a situation where you don't need to do anything but look at the whole numbers. All right, so make sure that you are looking at the whole numbers first. And 2 is greater than 1. Therefore, you don't need to do anything with the fractions. You don't need to find least common multiple. You don't need to find common denominators. You just compare the whole numbers. 2 is greater than 1. So 2 and 11/12 is always going to be greater than 1 7/8. Moving on to number 3 now. We have whole numbers the same, 4 and 4. So if the whole numbers are the same, the only thing we're comparing is the fractions. So we're going to compare 5/12 and see if that is less than, greater than, or equal to 1/2. All right, so number 1, finding common denominators. Least common multiple, 12, 24, and so on. For 2, it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and so on. And I see that we have a common multiple here. That's going to give us our new denominator. So we can convert each one of these to a denominator of 12. All right, fraction with a denominator of 12. This one already has the denominator of 12, so we don't need to do anything with that. But on this side, 1/2 equals something over 12. And we find that by multiplication. 2 times 6 equals 12. Then multiplying the same thing with the numerator. Now it's pretty simple to see. 6/12 and 5/12 compared. 5/12 is less than 6/12. So 4 and 5/12 is less than 4 and 1/2. Our common mistakes. Okay, not comparing the whole numbers first. I already showed you an example of that, but this is very, very common. Students will list out something like this, 3 3/5, comparing that to 4 4/7, and they'll start in on the common denominators, and they'll list out all their multiples without ever just checking whole numbers. Right, 4 is greater than 3. You don't need to go any further than that. It's just, that's it. The other thing is that students sometimes will not recognize when you have improper fractions. So you might have something like this, 10 over 11, and you're comparing that to something like 15 over 12. Right, and again, immediately you should say, all right, any improper fraction has a value over 1. Any regular fraction has a value less than 1. So I wouldn't need to go any further than this. I can say that 15/12 is greater than 10 over 11 anytime. So make sure that you're looking for your improper fractions and taking them into consideration. Sometimes you see things like mixed numbers, 1 3/5 is that less than, greater than, or equal to 8/5, and people will look at the whole numbers and say, well, this one has a whole number and this one has nothing for the whole number, therefore this one must be greater. Well, this is actually an improper fraction, which should be converted to a mixed number. 8/5 would be converted to 1 3/5. Now you can see that it's equal, but it didn't look equal when you just looked at the whole number part. So number 1, make sure that you're comparing the whole numbers. Number 2, recognize the improper fractions, and if you need to, convert them to a mixed number before you go on with your comparison. So what are we going to be doing today? We're going to be doing H7-12 out of your homework book, and problems 1 through 9. All, reminder, be as organized as you can, as organized as possible. 5th grade math is almost all about organization. So when you're listing multiples, when you're converting equivalent fractions, just make sure that they're all neat. If you can do that, you're going to have some success in this lesson. Good luck.